There was a study done in the 1950s by a psychologist named Solomon Asch where he put a person in a room with 7 other people and showed them all a line, then showed them 3 comparison lines and asked which one matched the original, and the answer was obvious. Anyone could see which line matched, but here's the twist. The 7 other people in the room were actors, and they all deliberately chose the wrong line. And what happened next is disturbing because the real participant, knowing the correct answer, hearing everyone else confidently choose the wrong answer, agreed with the group over a third of the time. They looked at a line that was clearly different and said it matched because everyone else said it matched. And when Ash interviewed them afterward, most of them knew they were giving the wrong answer. They could see the lines didn't match, but the pressure to conform, the discomfort of being the only one with a different answer, was so strong that they overrode their own perception and went along with the group. Now you might think you'd never do that. You'd never let a group make you deny what you can clearly see, but you do it every day. You just don't notice because it's not about lines on a page. It's about opinions and beliefs and behaviors and choices. And the conformity isn't dramatic. It's subtle. It's gradual. It's so woven into how you think and what you want and who you are that you can't see where you end and the group begins. And this isn't a moral failing. This isn't weakness. This is how human brains are designed. We're social animals. We evolved in small tribes where fitting in meant survival and standing out meant death. And that programming is still running, still making you scan the room to see what everyone else is doing, still making you adjust your opinions to match the consensus, still making you feel anxious when you're out of step with the group. Think about the last time you were in a meeting or a group conversation and you had a thought that contradicted what everyone else was saying, and you felt that moment, that split second where you had to decide whether to speak up or stay quiet. And notice what happened in your body, the tension, the risk calculation, the immediate awareness that speaking up means standing out, means potentially being wrong, means potentially being judged or rejected or isolated, and most of the time, unless you're very sure of yourself or the stakes are very high, you stay quiet, you let the group consensus stand, you conform not because you agree but because disagreeing feels dangerous at a level that's deeper than logic, and you tell yourself it doesn't matter, it's not important, you'll speak up next time, but next time the same thing happens and you conform again, and slowly, over hundreds of these small moments, your thoughts start to align with the group not because you've been convinced but because you've learned what's safe to think. The crowd doesn't control you through force, it controls you through comfort, through the promise that if you think like everyone else, dress like everyone else, want what everyone else wants, you'll be accepted, you'll belong, you'll be safe. And the threat isn't explicit, nobody's saying, conform or we'll reject you. But the message is there in every raised eyebrow, every awkward silence. Every time someone expresses an unpopular opinion and the room goes cold, you learn what's acceptable. And what isn't, you learn which thoughts can be spoken and which ones make you weird or difficult or problematic, and you adjust accordingly. And the adjustment happens so gradually, so naturally, that you don't even realize you're doing it. You think these are your own thoughts, your own preferences, your own values. But how many of them did you actually choose versus how many did you absorb from the people around you because absorbing them was easier than resisting them? Here's what's insidious about conformity. It doesn't feel like conformity, it feels like agreement. It feels like you genuinely believe what the group believes, genuinely want what the group wants, because your brain is incredibly good at post hoc rationalization, at creating logical reasons for decisions you made for social reasons. You convince yourself that you like this music or this style or this political position because you genuinely like it, not because everyone around you likes it, and maybe you do genuinely like it, but the question is, would you have discovered it on your own? Would you have chosen it if nobody else had chosen it first? Or did you come to like it because liking it meant fitting in? And once you liked it for that reason, your brain created a whole narrative about why you like it that has nothing to do with conformity. There's a concept called preference falsification where you publicly support something you privately disagree with. And over time, the public performance starts to shape the private belief. You start acting like you agree, then you start telling yourself you agree, then eventually you actually do agree because the cognitive dissonance of saying one thing and believing another is uncomfortable. So your brain resolves the dissonance by changing your belief to match your behavior. And this is how. Social pressure doesn't just change what you say, it changes what you think. It changes who you are, one small compromise at a time, one small adjustment to fit in, until the person you've become is barely recognizable from the person you started as, and you don't even notice because each individual change was so small, so reasonable, so much easier than resisting. I'll give you an example from my own life. I spent years in environments where certain political views were just assumed, where everyone agreed on certain things and disagreeing would have meant being an outsider, and I found myself nodding along, agreeing, even advocating for positions I wasn't entirely sure I believed in, and I told myself I was just being diplomatic, just keeping the peace, but the truth is I was scared, Scared of being judged, scared of being excluded, scared of having to defend myself against the group. And over time those positions stopped feeling foreign, they started to feel natural. I started to actually believe them because believing them was easier than holding the tension of disagreeing privately while conforming publicly. And it wasn't until I left that environment, until I was around people with different views, that I realized how much of what I thought was mine was actually just absorbed. How much I'd conformed without even noticing I was conforming. The mechanism is simple but powerful. Humans have a deep need to belong, to be part of a group. And that need is so strong that it overrides almost everything else. It overrides your perception, your judgment, your values, your sense of self, because evolutionarily speaking, being wrong while fitting in was safer than being right while standing alone. The person who stayed with the tribe even when the tribe was wrong survived. The person who insisted on being right and got expelled from the tribe died, and that logic is still embedded in your nervous system, still making you prioritize belonging over truth, still making you scan for social cues about what's acceptable, still making you feel visceral discomfort when you're out of sync with the group. What makes modern conformity particularly dangerous is that it's invisible. You're not being forced to agree, you're not even being explicitly pressured. You're just surrounded by a certain set of ideas and behaviors and the absence of alternatives, and your brain, trying to make sense of the world, assumes that what everyone around you believes must be true, must be right, because if it wasn't, surely someone would say something. Surely there would be dissent, but there isn't dissent because everyone else is also conforming, everyone else is also staying quiet, everyone else is also assuming that everyone else genuinely agrees, and this creates a spiral where everyone conforms to what they think is the consensus even though there might not be a real consensus. There might just be a bunch of people all pretending to agree because they think everyone else agrees. The crowd is most powerful when you don't realize it's there. When you think you're making independent choices but you're actually just following a script that was written by the aggregate preferences and behaviors of everyone around you, and the script is convincing because it feels natural, it feels like common sense, it feels like just the way things are, but the way things are is just the way most people have agreed things should be, often without anyone ever explicitly agreeing, just through the accumulated weight of everyone doing the same thing and nobody questioning why. The most effective form of control is the kind you don't notice. And social conformity works because it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't present itself as pressure, it just exists as the background assumption of what's normal, what's acceptable, what's expected. And you navigate your life relative to that background without ever questioning whether the background itself is real or just a collective hallucination that everyone's agreed to maintain. And this is how you end up living according to rules you never consciously accepted, pursuing goals you never chose, avoiding behaviors that would actually be fine but feel transgressive simply because nobody else is doing them. And the genius of it is that it feels like freedom. It feels like you're making your own choices, because nobody's forcing you, nobody's threatening you, you're just doing what seems reasonable, what seems obvious, what seems like what anyone would do in your situation. But what anyone would do is just what most people do, and most people are also conforming, also following the script, also mistaking consensus for truth. And this creates a reality where everyone's behavior is based on everyone else's behavior, and nobody's behavior is based on actual independent thought or preference. It's just an infinite loop of conformity reinforcing conformity. And the loop is stable because breaking it requires someone to step out and do something different. And stepping out feels dangerous, feels exposing, feels like you're the one who's wrong because you're the one who's different. Even though different doesn't mean wrong, it just means you're not following the pattern that everyone else is following. And they're only following it because everyone else is following it. There's no actual reason, just momentum. Here's where it gets particularly insidious. The crowd doesn't just influence what you do, it influences what you want. It shapes your desires themselves. You think you want certain things, a certain lifestyle, a certain career, a certain relationship structure, certain possessions, certain experiences. But if you really examine where those wants came from, how many of them originated in you versus how many were installed by exposure to what other people want? By marketing, by social media, by the aggregate preferences of your social environment. And the installation is so seamless that you can't tell the difference. You feel genuine desire for things that were algorithmically optimized to make you feel desire. You pursue goals that were handed to you by the culture you exist in. And you call this authenticity, you call this knowing yourself. But knowing yourself and knowing what the crowd has told you to want are not the same thing. I see this most clearly in major life decisions. The things people are supposed to want at certain ages, marriage by 30, kids by 35, house in the suburbs, stable career, retirement plan, and these aren't inherently bad things, but notice how rarely people actually stop and ask themselves if they want them versus whether they're supposed to want them. Whether pursuing them feels like an authentic expression of their values or whether it feels like checking boxes on a cultural script. That defines what a successful adult life looks like. And most people never ask that question because asking it is uncomfortable. It means confronting the possibility that you've been following a path you didn't choose, that you've been working toward goals that aren't actually yours, and it's easier to just keep following the path, keep checking the boxes, keep assuming that the discomfort you feel is just normal adult responsibility rather than the friction of living a life that doesn't actually fit you. The mechanism here is comparison. You're constantly measuring yourself against other people, seeing what they have, what they're doing, where they are in life, and using that as a reference point for whether you're succeeding or failing, and this comparison is relentless. It's happening constantly, often unconsciously, and it shapes everything. It makes you want things you don't actually want just because not having them while others do feels like falling behind. It makes you stay in situations that don't serve you because leaving would mean admitting you made a mistake while everyone else seems to be making it work. It creates a competitive framework where your happiness is relative rather than absolute, where you can have a good life but feel like you're losing because someone else has a better one, and this is exhausting. It's a treadmill you can never get off because there's always someone ahead of you, always someone with more or better or different, and the comparison never ends. The feeling of being behind never resolves. You just keep chasing, keep conforming, keep trying to match the people around you while they're trying to match the people around them, and nobody's actually happy. Everyone's just performing happiness while privately feeling inadequate. What makes this particularly hard to escape is that the crowd isn't monolithic. You don't belong to one crowd. You belong to multiple overlapping crowds: your family, your friends, your workplace, your online communities, your geographic location, your socioeconomic class, your generation, and each crowd has its own norms and expectations and definitions of what's acceptable. And you're constantly navigating between them, code switching, adjusting your behavior and opinions to fit whichever crowd you're currently in, and this fragmentation makes it even harder to know who you actually are because you're a different version of yourself in each context, and none of those versions feel entirely real. They're all performances calibrated to fit the expectations of the audience you're with, and the exhausting part is that the performances become so habitual that you lose track of what you do or think or say if nobody was watching. If there was no crowd to perform for, if you could just be without worrying about whether being yourself is acceptable to the people around you. There's also a temporal element to conformity that people don't talk about enough. You're not just conforming to your current crowd, you're conforming to your past self, to the person you've been, to the commitments you've made, to the identity you've constructed. And changing course means admitting that past you was wrong or mistaken or operating with incomplete information, and that's hard, that feels like failure. So you keep going in the direction you've been going even when it's clearly not working, even when you've outgrown it, even when it's making you miserable, because changing direction means confronting all the sunk costs, all the time and energy and resources you've invested in becoming this version of yourself. And it's easier to just keep being that version, keep living that life, keep making choices that are consistent with who you've been rather than who you actually want to become. The way out starts with noticing, with paying attention to the moments when you're conforming, when you're adjusting yourself to fit the crowd, when you're choosing comfort over authenticity. And just noticing doesn't mean you have to change everything immediately. It doesn't mean you have to reject every social norm or become a contrarian. It just means you start seeing the pattern. Start recognizing when you're following the crowd versus when you're making genuine choices. And that awareness creates space, creates the possibility of choosing differently, of asking whether this particular conformity serves you or whether you're just doing it because everyone else is doing it and not doing it feels scary. The question isn't whether you should conform. Some conformity is necessary, is useful, makes life easier. The question is whether you're conforming consciously, whether you've actually examined the norms you're following and decided they work for you, or whether you're just defaulting to what everyone else does because that's the path of least resistance, and most people are on the path of least resistance. Most people have never actually questioned the major assumptions that structure their lives. They've just absorbed them, internalized them, and then convince themselves that these absorbed assumptions are their own authentic desires, and breaking out of that, really breaking out, requires a level of self-examination that's uncomfortable, that's lonely. That means looking at your life and asking hard questions about how much of it is actually yours versus how much is just you performing a role that the crowd wrote for you. So what do you do with this awareness, knowing that so much of what you think is yours was actually installed by the crowd, knowing that your preferences and opinions and desires are less authentic than you believed, knowing that you're conforming in ways you can't even see because the conformity has become part of who you are? Does that mean everything you think and want is suspect? Does it mean you have to rebuild yourself from scratch? Reject everything, start over? And the answer is no, but the answer also isn't to just go back to sleep, to ignore this information, To keep following the crowd while telling yourself you're not. Because you can't unknow what you now know, you can't unsee the pattern once you've seen it, and pretending you don't see it just makes you complicit in your own conformity. The work is in examination, in taking the major assumptions and beliefs and desires that structure your life and actually interrogating them, asking where they came from, asking whether they serve you, asking whether you'd choose them again if you were choosing from scratch. And some of them you will choose again. Some conformity is useful, some norms make sense, some of what the crowd does is actually good and right and worth following. But some of it isn't, some of it is arbitrary, some of it made sense for other people but doesn't make sense for you. Some of it you're only following because not following it feels transgressive, and distinguishing between useful conformity and arbitrary conformity requires honest self-examination that most people never do. There's a specific kind of courage required to live differently, not the courage to be loudly different, not the courage to make a statement or prove a point, but the quiet courage to just not participate in norms that don't serve you, to opt out without making a scene about it, to let other people follow the script while you do something else. And this is harder than it sounds because it means accepting that you'll be misunderstood, that people will project their own fears and insecurities onto your choices, that your nonconformity will make other people uncomfortable because it calls into question their own conformity, and you can't control that, you can't make people understand. You can only decide whether you're going to live according to what works for you or according to what makes other people comfortable. I'll tell you what changed for me. I stopped defending my choices, stopped explaining why I was doing things differently, stopped trying to convince people that my nonconformity was justified, because the need to justify it was itself a form of conformity. It was seeking the crowd's approval for not conforming, and that's contradictory. That's still letting the crowd determine what's acceptable. I just started doing what made sense to me and letting people think whatever they wanted to think. And the interesting thing is that once you stop defending yourself, once you stop seeking approval, most people stop caring. They move on. They find someone else to project onto, because your nonconformity is only threatening to them if you seem uncertain about it, if you seem like you're questioning it. But if you're just calmly living your life according to your own logic, most people will eventually accept it or at least ignore it. The other thing I learned is that nonconformity isn't about being different for the sake of being different. It's not about rejecting everything the crowd does just to prove you're independent. That's just conformity in reverse. That's still letting the crowd control you by defining yourself in opposition to them. Real independence is not caring what the crowd does, not using them as a reference point at all. Just figuring out what works for you and doing that, whether it happens to align with what everyone else is doing or whether it doesn't. And this is subtler than it seems because your brain wants a reference point, wants to know if you're normal or weird, ahead or behind, winning or losing. And learning to let go of that need, learning to just exist without constantly measuring yourself against others, that's the real work. There's also something important about finding your actual crowd, not just accepting the crowd you were born into or the crowd that's geographically close or the crowd that's easiest to access, but actively seeking out people who share your actual values, who are asking the same questions, who have opted out of the same norms, because isolation is hard. Being the only one who thinks differently in your immediate environment is exhausting. And you don't have to be the only one. There are other people who see what you see, who question what you question, who are building lives that don't follow the standard script. And finding them, connecting with them, creates a different kind of conformity, a chosen conformity rather than a default one. And that's not a weakness, that's just humans being social animals. We need community, we need belonging. The question is whether you're conforming to a community you chose or a community you just happen to be born into. The hard truth is that most people will never do this work. Most people will live their entire lives following the crowd, pursuing goals they don't actually want, holding opinions they never examined, making choices based on what everyone else is doing, and they'll die never knowing who they actually were beneath all the conformity. And that's sad, but it's also a choice. It's easier to follow, easier to conform, easier to let the crowd determine what you think and want and do. And most people will choose easy, will choose comfortable, will choose fitting in over the discomfort of examining their own lives. And you can't change that. You can only decide whether you're going to be one of them or whether you're going to do the harder thing. What I want you to understand is that awareness is the first step, but it's not the last step. Knowing that you conform doesn't automatically free you from conforming. You still have to make different choices, still have to tolerate the discomfort of standing out, still have to build the muscle of thinking independently. And this is a practice, not a destination. You don't wake up one day fully liberated from social influence. You just get better at noticing it, better at questioning it, better at choosing when to conform and when to resist. And over time that practice changes you, changes what feels normal, changes what feels possible, until one day you realize you're living a life that's actually yours, not because you rejected everything the crowd does, but because you examined everything and kept what worked and discarded what didn't. If you found this valuable, if it made you see the invisible forces shaping your choices more clearly, subscribe to the channel. I make videos about psychology, conformity, and the unconscious patterns that run our lives, and your support helps me keep making this content. But here's the real question. What are you going to do with this information? Are you going to notice the conformity and then conform anyway? Are you going to see the pattern and decide it's easier to just keep following it? Or are you going to start making different choices, start examining your assumptions, start living more deliberately? Because awareness without action is just intellectual masturbation. It's just knowing things without letting that knowledge change anything. And change is hard. Change is uncomfortable. Change means accepting that you've been wrong about things, that you've been following scripts that don't serve you, that you've been letting the crowd determine your life. But the alternative is continuing to let the crowd determine your life while now being aware that that's what you're doing. And that's worse. That's choosing unconsciousness while being conscious. That's seeing the cage and deciding to stay in it anyway. The crowd will always be there, will always be offering you the comfort of conformity, the ease of just doing what everyone else does, the safety of fitting in. And that offer is seductive. It's tempting, it's the path of least resistance, but the path of least resistance doesn't lead anywhere interesting. It just leads to the same place everyone else ends up, living the same life, pursuing the same goals, dying with the same regrets. And you can choose that, you can choose to follow, you can choose to conform, but now you know that's what you're doing. You can't pretend it's inevitable, can't pretend you don't have a choice, because you do have a choice. You've always had a choice, you just haven't been making it consciously. And making it consciously, choosing deliberately whether to follow or resist in each moment, that's what it means to be free, not freedom from all influence, not some imaginary state of pure independence, just freedom to choose, to examine, to decide for yourself whether the crowd's way is your way, or whether you need to find a different path. And that decision, that choice to examine rather than just follow, to question rather than just accept, to live deliberately rather than just drift along with everyone else, that's where your actual life begins. That's where you stop being a passenger and become the author. And it's uncomfortable and it's uncertain and it's lonely sometimes, but it's yours, it's actually yours, not a borrowed life, not a performed life, not a life lived according to someone else's script. And that difference, that ownership, that's everything, that's the whole point, that's what makes the discomfort worth it.